Hello everyone, and welcome back to Deep Chronicles World. Before you cozy up and drift off into dreamland, I've got a fun idea. Why not drop a comment below and share where in the world you're tuning in from? And hey, if you're enjoying these stories as much as I love sharing them, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Now, let's get comfy, relax, and dive into tonight's tale. Ready? Let's begin. City of Los Angeles glimmered like a jewel under the California sun, a place where dreams were made and broken in equal measure. It was a city of contrasts. Luxury sports cars zoomed past homeless encampments, and the mansions of Hollywood elites stood just miles away from struggling neighborhoods. In this world of glitz and glamour, where fame was the ultimate currency, a group of teenagers dared to dream bigger than most. But their dreams weren't of red carpets or Oscar awards. They were of fast money, stolen treasures, and the thrill of outsmarting the rich and famous. At the center of this story was Nicholas Prugo, a young man with a fragile ego and a burning desire to be someone important. Born and raised in the San Fernando Valley, Nicholas grew up in the shadow of Hollywood's towering success. He wasn't rich, he wasn't particularly confident, and he certainly wasn't famous. But he had one thing, an unshakable belief that he was destined for greatness. Nicholas's journey into the world of crime began innocently enough. He met Rachel Lee, a girl who was everything he wasn't: confident, charismatic, and fearless. Rachel had an obsession with celebrities and their lavish lifestyles. She introduced Nicholas to a world he had only seen from afar. Together, they started small, stealing from unlocked cars in the upscale neighborhoods of Calabasas. It was almost too easy. People in these areas were so trusting, so careless, that they often left their cars unlocked with valuables inside. Nicholas and Rachel would drive around at night, scouting for opportunities. One night, they stumbled upon a brand new Porsche with the keys still in the ignition. The car was worth $75,000. And Rachel saw it as a sign. She turned to Nicholas and said, "This is our chance. Let's take it." Nicholas hesitated. Fear of getting caught gnawed at him, but Rachel's confidence was infectious. She assured him that they wouldn't get caught, and against his better judgment, Nicholas agreed. They drove off in the stolen Porsche, their hearts racing with adrenaline. To avoid detection, they swapped the license plates with those of a similar car, a trick they had learned from watching crime shows. For the next year, Nicholas and Rachel continued their spree, stealing cars and valuables from unsuspecting victims. But as their confidence grew, so did their ambitions. They wanted more and more money, more excitement, more recognition. Their first big break came when they targeted the home of a YouTuber named Eden Sassoon. Eden had posted on MySpace about traveling for 11 days, leaving his home unattended. Nicholas and Rachel saw this as the perfect opportunity. Using the information Eden had shared online, they located his address and scouted the area. On the night of the robbery, they found the back door unlocked, the stroke of luck that felt almost too good to be true. Inside, they found $3,000 in cash and other valuables. It was their biggest haul yet, and it fueled their desire for more. But this was just the beginning. Nicholas and Rachel soon realized that the internet was a goldmine of information. Celebrities and influencers often shared details about their lives online, from their travel plans to the layout of their homes. This made them easy targets. Their next victim was Paris Hilton, the heiress and reality TV star. Paris had posted a photo on Instagram wearing a $4 million diamond ring, and Nicholas and Rachel knew they had to act fast. They spent weeks monitoring her movements, studying her routines, and planning their heist. When the time came, they executed their plan with military precision. Disguised as police officers, they entered Paris's apartment, tied her up, and made off with millions of dollars worth of jewelry. The Paris Hilton robbery was a turning point for Nicholas and Rachel. It catapulted them into the big leagues, but it also put them on the radar of law enforcement. The police launched a massive investigation, and Nicholas knew they had to be more careful. But the thrill of the heist was addictive, and they couldn't stop. They continued to target celebrities, using the same methods, scouting their targets online, studying their routines, and striking when the time was right. Each robbery was more daring than the last, and each time they walked away with more loot. But as their crimes grew bolder, so did the risks. Nicholas began to feel the pressure. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, paranoid that the police were closing in. Rachel, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. She thrived on the adrenaline, the rush of outsmarting the rich and famous. Their dynamic began to shift, and cracks started to form in their partnership. Nicholas wanted to slow down, but Rachel was hungry for more. Their next target was actress Adrienne Patridge. Adrienne had posted about attending the Oscars, leaving her home empty. Nicholas and Rachel saw this as another golden opportunity. They broke into her mansion, stealing designer clothes, jewelry, and cash. But this time, they were caught on camera. The surveillance footage was grainy, but it was enough to put the police on their trail. Nicholas knew they were playing a dangerous game, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. The final straw came when they targeted Lindsay Lohan. Lindsay was one of the most famous actresses in the world. In her home was a treasure trove of valuables. Nicholas and Rachel, along with a new accomplice named Diana Tamayo, broke into Lindsay's house and made off with a fortune in stolen goods. But this time, the police were ready. They had been tracking Nicholas and Rachel for months, and they were closing in. Nicholas's world began to unravel. His accomplices turned on each other, and the police were hot on his trail. He knew it was only a matter of time before he was caught. But even as the walls closed in, Nicholas couldn't shake the feeling that he was destined for something greater. He had started this journey as a nobody, but now he was one of the most wanted criminals in Los Angeles. For Nicholas, that was a kind of fame, Jess, not the kind he had imagined. The story of Nicholas Prugo and Rachel Lee wasn't just about theft, it was about ambition, obsession, and the intoxicating allure of fame. By 2009, their gang, which would later be dubbed the Bling Ring by the media, had become a well-oiled machine. They weren't just stealing from celebrities, they were living like them. Designer clothes, luxury handbags, and expensive jewelry became their everyday attire. They flaunted their stolen goods on social media, posting pictures of themselves, draped in Chanel, Gucci, and Louis Vuitton. To the outside world, they looked like young, successful socialites living the high life. But behind the glitz and glamour was a dangerous game of cat and mouse with the law. Nicholas and Cleese and Rachel's partnership was the backbone of the Bling Ring. Nicholas was the brains of the operation, meticulously planning each heist and studying their target's every move. Rachel, on the other hand, was the fearless leader, the one who pushed them to take bigger risks. Together, they were unstoppable. But as their fame grew, so did their egos. Nicholas began to see himself as a mastermind, a criminal genius who could outsmart anyone. Rachel, meanwhile, became increasingly reckless, convinced that they were invincible. Their next target was Orlando Bloom, the British heartthrob, known for his roles in Pirates of the Caribbean and The Lord of the Rings. Orlando's home was a fortress with high walls and state-of-the-art security systems. But Nicholas had done his homework. He knew that Orlando was out of town. He knew, and he had studied the layout of the property using Google Maps. On the night of the heist, Nicholas, Rachel, and their new accomplice, Diana Tamayo, arrived at Orlando's mansion dressed in all black, their faces covered with scarves. They scaled the fence and made their way to the backyard, where they found an unlocked glass door. It was almost too easy. Inside, the house was a treasure trove of luxury. Designer clothes hung in the closets. Rolex watches gleamed in the drawers. and stacks of cash were scattered throughout the rooms. Nicholas and his crew moved quickly, filling their bags with as much loot as they could carry. But as they were leaving, Nicholas noticed something that made his blood run cold. Surveillance camera pointed directly at them. He knew they had been caught on tape, but there was no time to worry about it now. They fled the scene, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. The next morning, Orlando returned home to find his house ransacked. The police were called, and the surveillance footage was reviewed. The images were blurry, but they clearly showed 3 figures entering and leaving the property. The media quickly picked up the story, and the bling ring was thrust into the spotlight. For Nicholas, this was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, he loved the attention. For the first time in his life, he felt important. On the other hand, he knew that the police were closing in. As the pressure mounted, cracks began to form in the bling ring. Nicholas and Rachel's relationship grew tense, with each blaming the other for their close calls with the law. Diana, who had joined the group hoping for a taste of the high life, began to have second thoughts. She had never imagined that things would get this dangerous. Meanwhile, the media frenzy surrounding the bling ring only grew. News outlets dubbed them the Hollywood Hills burglars, and their exploits became the talk of the town. But the bling ring wasn't just about Nicholas, Rachel, and Diana. There were others involved: Alexis Nyers, her sister Gabby, and their friend Tess. Alexis was a wannabe actress with dreams of fame and fortune. She had grown up in the shadow of Hollywood, surrounded by the glitz and glamour of the entertainment industry. Unlike Nicholas and Rachel, Alexis wasn't content with stealing from celebrities. She wanted to be one. Alexis's involvement with the bling ring began innocently enough. She had met Nicholas at a nightclub, and the two quickly hit it off. Nicholas, always the charmer, told her that he was a celebrity stylist and offered to help her break into the industry. Alexis was flattered and eager to impress. When Nicholas invited her to join him and Rachel on a heist, she didn't hesitate. It was her chance to live like a star, even if only for a night. But as the heists grew more daring, Alexis began to feel the weight of what they were doing. She had always dreamed of fame, but this wasn't the kind of attention she wanted. Media was painting the bling ring as a group of spoiled, entitled kids who thought they were above the law. Alexis knew that if they were caught, her dreams of becoming an actress would be over. The final straw came when the bling ring targeted Lindsay Lohan. Lindsay was one of the most famous actresses in the world, and her home was a treasure trove of valuables. Nicholas, Rachel, and Diana broke into Lindsay's house and made off with a fortune in stolen goods. But this time, the police were ready. They had been tracking the bling ring for months, and they were closing in. Nicholas's world began to unravel. His accomplices turned on each other, and the police were hot on his trail. He knew it was only a matter of time before he was caught. But even as the walls closed in, Nicholas couldn't shake the feeling that he was destined for something greater. He had started this journey as a nobody, but now he was one of the most wanted criminals in Los Angeles. For Nicholas, that was a kind of fame, just not the kind he had imagined. The bling ring's reign of terror couldn't last forever. By the summer of 2009, the walls were closing in. The police had been piecing together evidence for months, and the media's relentless coverage of the burglaries had turned the group into household names. But fame, as they would soon learn, was a double-edged sword. For every admiring fan who saw them as modern-day Robin Hoods, there were 10 others who viewed them as entitled criminals who needed to be brought to justice. The pressure was mounting, and the cracks within the group were beginning to show. Nicholas Prugo, once the confident mastermind, was now a bundle of nerves. He had always been the one to plan the heists, to study the targets, and to ensure that every detail was perfect. But the Lindsay Lohan robbery had shaken him. The surveillance footage from Orlando Bloom's mansion had been released to the public. Hey, while the images were blurry, Nicholas knew it was only a matter of time before someone recognized him. He began to distance himself from Rachel Lee, the fearless leader who had once been his closest ally. Rachel, however, seemed unfazed. She was still riding the high of their success, convinced that they were untouchable. The turning point came when Alexis Nyers, one of the newer members of the Bling Ring, decided she had had enough. Alexis had joined the group hoping for a taste of the high life, but the reality of their crimes had begun to weigh heavily on her conscience. She had always dreamed of fame, but this wasn't the kind of attention she wanted. The media was painting the Bling Ring as a group of spoiled, entitled kids who thought they were above the law. Alexis knew that if they were caught, her dreams of becoming an actress would be over. One night, after a particularly tense argument with Nicholas, Alexis made a decision that would change everything. She picked up the phone and called the police. In a trembling voice, she told them everything she knew about the Bling Ring, their heists, their targets, and their methods. She even gave them Nicholas's name. It was a betrayal that would send shockwaves through the group, but for Alexis, it was a desperate attempt to save herself. The police acted quickly. Armed with the information Alexis had provided, they obtained a warrant to search Nicholas's home. When they arrived, they found a treasure trove of stolen goods, designer clothes, luxury handbags, and expensive jewelry. Nicholas was arrested on the spot, his face pale with shock. He had always known that this day might come, but he had never imagined it would happen like this. As news of Nicholas's arrest spread, the rest of the Bling Ring began to panic. Rachel Lee, who had always been the most confident member of the group, was now a nervous wreck. She knew that it was only a matter of time before the police came. For her, Diana Tamayo, who had joined the group hoping for a taste of the high life, was filled with regret. She had never imagined that things would get this dangerous. The police wasted no time in rounding up the rest of the group. Rachel was arrested at her home in Las Vegas, where she had fled in a desperate attempt to escape the law. Diana was picked up at her apartment, her face streaked with tears as she was led away in handcuffs. Even Alexis, who had betrayed the group to save herself, wasn't spared. The police had found evidence linking her to the Lindsay Lohan robbery, and she was arrested alongside the others. The media frenzy surrounding the arrests was unlike anything Los Angeles had ever seen. The Bling Ring, once a group of anonymous thieves, were now the most talked about criminals in the country. News outlets scrambled to uncover every detail of their lives, from their childhoods to their motivations. The group's mugshots were splashed across the front pages of newspapers, their faces a stark contrast to the glamorous images they had once posted on social media. For Nicholas, the reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. He had always seen himself as a mastermind, a criminal genius who could outsmart anyone. But now, sitting in a jail cell, he felt like a fool. He had risked everything for a taste of fame, and now he had nothing to show for it. The only thing he had left was his pride, and even that was slipping away. The trials that followed were a media circus. Each member of the Bling Ring was charged with multiple counts of burglary, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. Surveillance footage, stolen goods, and testimonies from their accomplices painted a damning picture. Nicholas, who had once been the confident leader of the group, was now a broken man. He pleaded guilty to the charges against him, hoping that his cooperation would earn him a lighter sentence. Rachel, on the other hand, refused to back down. She maintained her innocence, claiming that she had been coerced into participating in the heists, but the evidence against her was too strong, and she was eventually convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison. Diana, who had always been the most reluctant member of the group, received a lighter sentence of 3 years of probation and community service. Alexis, who had betrayed the group to save herself, was sentenced to 6 months in prison. But even as she served her time, she couldn't escape the media's relentless scrutiny. Her mugshot became one of the most iconic images of the Bling Ring saga, a stark reminder of the consequences of her actions. For the members of the Bling Ring, the arrests marked the end of an era. They had started out as a group of teenagers with big dreams and even bigger ambitions. But their quest for fame and fortune had led them down a dark path, one that ended in betrayal, arrests, and shattered dreams. The fall of the Bling Ring was as dramatic as its rise. By the time the dust settled, the group that had once been the talk of Hollywood was now a cautionary tale. The media, which had once glorified their exploits, now painted them as entitled criminals who had gotten what they deserved. But for the members of the Bling Ring, the aftermath of their arrests was a time of reflection, regret, and, for some, redemption. Nicholas Prugo, the self-proclaimed mastermind of the group, was the first to face the consequences of his actions. After pleading guilty to multiple counts of burglary, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. But for Nicholas, the hardest part wasn't the time behind bars, it was the realization that he had thrown away his life for nothing. He had always dreamed of fame, but now he was infamous, his name forever associated with crime and betrayal, in prison. Nicholas had plenty of time to think about what had gone wrong. He thought about Rachel Lee, his former partner in crime, Kay, and how their friendship had disintegrated under the weight of their crimes. He thought about Alexis Nyers, the girl who had betrayed him to save herself, and wondered if he would have done the same in her position. Most of all, he thought about his family, the people who had stood by him even when he had let them down. When Nicholas was released from prison after serving just 1 year of his sentence, was a changed man. He knew that he could never undo the damage he had done, but he was determined to make amends. He started by reaching out to his victims, apologizing for the pain he had caused. It wasn't easy. Many of them wanted nothing to do with him, but Nicholas was determined to prove that he was more than just a criminal. Rachel Lee, on the other hand, struggled to come to terms with her new reality. She had always been the fearless leader of the Bling Ring, the one who pushed the group to take bigger risks. But now, sitting in a prison cell, she felt like a shadow of her former self. Confidence that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a deep sense of regret. Rachel's time in prison was a wake-up call. She realized that she had been chasing the wrong kind of fame, the kind that came at the expense of others. When she was released after serving 4 years of her sentence, she was determined to turn her life around. She cut ties with her old friends and started over, hoping to leave her criminal past behind. Diana DeMaio, the most reluctant member of the Bling Ring, was the only one who managed to avoid prison time. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation and 60 days of community service, relatively light punishment compared to the others. But for Diana, the emotional toll of her involvement in the group was punishment enough. She had joined the Bling Ring hoping for a taste of the high life, but the reality of their crimes had left her feeling empty and disillusioned. After her probation ended, Kana moved away from Los Angeles, hoping to start a new life far from the spotlight. She found work as a waitress and tried to put the past behind her. But the memories of what she had done and what she had lost haunted her. Alexis Nyers, the girl who had betrayed the group to save herself, faced her own set of challenges after her release from prison. Her mugshot had become one of the most iconic images of the Bling Ring saga, and she struggled to escape the stigma of her criminal past. But Alexis was determined to rebuild her life. She reconnected with her family and began working on a memoir, hoping to tell her side of the story. In 2010, Alexis's memoir, I'm Not Sorry, was published, and it quickly became a bestseller. The book was a raw and honest account of her involvement in the Bling Ring, and it offered a glimpse into the world of fame, obsession, and crime that had consumed her. For Alexis, writing the book was a form of therapy, a way to make sense of the choices she had made and the consequences she had faced. The media, which had once vilified the members of the Bling Ring, now began to see them in a different light. Nicholas, Rachel, Diana, and Alexis were no longer just criminals. They were human beings who had made mistakes and were trying to move on with their lives. Documentaries and interviews explored the psychological and social factors that had led them down the path of crime, and many began to see the Bling Ring as a product of a culture that glorified fame and materialism, but not everyone was willing to forgive and forget. The celebrities who had been targeted by the Bling Ring: Paris Hilton, Lindsay Lohan, Orlando Bloom, and others were still dealing with the aftermath of the burglaries. For them, the thefts weren't just about the loss of material possessions. They were a violation of their privacy and sense of security. Paris Hilton, who had been one of the Bling Ring's most high-profile victims, spoke out about the impact the burglaries had had on her life. "It's not just about the things they stole," she said in an interview. "It's about the feeling of being violated, of knowing that someone was in your home, going through your things, something you never really get over." Lindsay Lohan, who had also been targeted by the group, echoed Paris's sentiments. "It's a scary feeling," she said. "You start to question everything who you can trust, whether you're safe in your own home. It changes you." For the members of the Bling Ring, hearing these words was a painful reminder of the damage they had caused. They had been so focused on their own desires for fame, for money, for excitement, they had never stopped to consider the impact their actions would have on others. But even as they grappled with their guilt, the members of the Bling Ring found ways to move forward. Nicholas began working with at-risk youth, sharing his story in the hopes of preventing others from making the same mistakes he had. Rachel started a small business, using the skills she had learned in prison to build a new life for herself. Diana focused on her family, determined to be a better role model for her children, and Alexis continued to write, using her voice to advocate for criminal justice reform. The story of the Bling Ring is a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession, greed, and the pursuit of fame at any cost. But it's also a story of redemption, of people who made terrible mistakes and found the strength to rebuild their lives. For Nicholas, Rachel, Diana, and Alexis, the road to redemption was long and difficult, but it was a journey they were determined to take. The story of the Bling Ring didn't end with the arrests, cues, or even the personal redemptions of its members. It became a cultural phenomenon, a cautionary tale that resonated far beyond the borders of Los Angeles. The group's exploits were immortalized in books, documentaries, and even a major Hollywood film, turning their crimes into a spectacle that captivated audiences around the world. But beneath the glitz and glamour of their story lies a deeper lesson about the dangers of obsession, the allure of fame, and the consequences of living in a world where image is everything. In 2013, director Sofia Coppola brought the Bling Ring story to the big screen with her film The Bling Ring, starring Emma Watson as Alexis Nyers and a talented ensemble cast. The movie offered a stylized, almost dreamlike portrayal of the group's rise and fall. It was a critical and commercial success, sparking conversations about celebrity culture, materialism, the lengths people would go to for a taste of the high life. For the real-life members of the Bling Ring, the film was a surreal experience. Seeing their lives dramatized on screen was both flattering and unsettling, a reminder of how their actions had been transformed into entertainment. Alexis Nyers, whose character was central to the film, had mixed feelings about its portrayal of her. While she appreciated the attention and the opportunity to share her story, she also felt that the movie glossed over some of the darker aspects of her experience. "It's strange to see your life turned into a movie," she said in an interview. "There's a part of you that wants to be proud, but there's also a part of you that feels exposed, like people are judging you all over again." For Nicholas Prugo, the film was a painful reminder of the mistakes he had made. He watched it with a sense of detachment, as if he were viewing the life of someone else. It's hard to watch something like that and not feel regret, he admitted. See all the things you did wrong, all the people you hurt, and you wonder how you could have been so blind. The film also reignited public interest in the bling ring, prompting a wave of documentaries and interviews that explored the psychological and social factors behind their crimes. Many of these projects focused on the role of social media in the group's rise to infamy. The bling ring had used platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to track their targets, plan their heists, and flaunt their stolen goods. In doing so, they had exposed the dark side of the digital age world, where privacy is an illusion, and fame is just a click away. The media's fascination with the bling ring also highlighted the blurred lines between crime and entertainment. For some, the group's story was a thrilling tale of rebellion and excess, modern-day Bonnie and Clyde for the Instagram generation. For others, it was a sobering reminder of the dangers of celebrity worship and the toxic allure of materialism. The bling ring had been driven by a desire to live like the stars they idolized, but in the end, they became a cautionary tale about the cost of chasing fame at any cost. But the legacy of the bling ring isn't just about their crimes or the media, frenzy that followed. It's also about the lessons we can learn from their story. For many, the group's downfall serves as a reminder of the importance of self-awareness, accountability, and the dangers of losing sight of what really matters. Nicholas Prugo, who has spent years reflecting on his actions, hopes that his story can serve as a warning to others. I want people to understand that fame and money aren't everything, he said. They're not worth sacrificing your integrity, your relationships, or your freedom. I learned that the hard way, and I hope others can learn from my mistakes. Rachel Lee, who has largely stayed out of the public eye since her release from prison, echoes Nicholas's sentiments. It's easy to get caught up in the idea of being famous, of having everything you ever wanted, she said. But the truth is, those things don't make you happy. What really matters is the people you love and the life you build for yourself. For Alexis Nyers, the legacy of the bling ring is a complicated one. While she regrets the choices she made, she also sees her experience as an opportunity for growth and self-discovery. I've made a lot of mistakes, but I've also learned a lot about myself, she said. I've learned that true happiness comes from within, not from the things you own or the image you project. The bling ring story also raises important questions about the role of celebrity, culture, in shaping our values and aspirations. In a world where social media influencers and reality TV stars are often held up as role models, it's easy to lose sight of what really matters. The bling ring's obsession with fame and materialism is a reflection of a larger cultural trend, one that prioritizes image over substance and rewards superficiality over authenticity. But the story of the bling ring isn't just a critique of celebrity culture, it's also a testament to the power of redemption. Despite their mistakes, the members of the group have found ways to rebuild their lives and move forward. Nicholas has become an advocate for at-risk youth, using his story to inspire others to make better choices. Rachel has started a small business, focusing on her passion for fashion and design. Alexis has embraced her role as a writer and activist, using her voice to advocate for criminal justice reform. Their journeys are a reminder that no matter how far we fall, it's never too late to turn our lives around. The bling ring story is a cautionary tale, but it's also a story of resilience, growth, the enduring power of the human spirit. The story of the bling ring is one of ambition, obsession, and the relentless pursuit of fame. It's a tale that began with a group of teenagers who dreamed of living like the celebrities they idolized, and ended with their spectacular downfall. From their early days of stealing from unlocked cars to their audacious heists targeting Hollywood's elite, The bling ring captivated the public's imagination and exposed the dark side of celebrity culture. But as the dust settled and the media frenzy faded, what remained was a sobering reminder of the consequences of greed, betrayal, and the dangers of chasing fame at any cost. The bling ring's rise to infamy was fueled by a combination of ambition, opportunity, and the intoxicating allure of celebrity. Nicholas Prugo, the self-proclaimed mastermind, Kay, and Rachel Lee, the fearless leader, were the driving forces behind the group's crimes. They used social media to track their targets, study their routines, and plan their heists with military precision. Their targets Paris Hilton, Lindsay Lohan, Orlando Bloom, and others were more than just victims. They were symbols of the glamorous lifestyle the bling ring so desperately wanted to emulate. But as their crimes grew bolder, so did the risks. The group's downfall was as dramatic as their rise, marked by betrayal, arrests, and the harsh reality of life behind bars. Nicholas, Rachel, Alexis Nyers, Diana Tamayo, and the other members of the bling ring were forced to confront the consequences of their actions, both legally and personally. Their story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that the pursuit of fame and fortune often comes at a steep price. The aftermath of the bling ring's crimes was a time of reflection and redemption for its members. Nicholas, who had once dreamed of being a criminal mastermind, found himself grappling with guilt and regret. After serving time in prison, he dedicated himself to helping at-risk youth, using his story as a warning to others. Kayla's leader, who had always been so confident, struggled to rebuild her life after her release. She started a small business and tried to leave her criminal past behind, but the scars of her mistakes remained. Alexis Nyers, whose betrayal of the group had marked the beginning of the end, found redemption through writing and activism. Her memoir, I'm Not Sorry, offered a raw and honest account of her involvement in the bling ring and became a bestseller. She used her platform to advocate for criminal justice reform and to share the lessons she had learned from her mistakes. Diana Tamayo, the most reluctant member of the group, moved away from Los Angeles and focused on her family, determined to build a better life for herself and her children. The bling ring story also had a profound impact on their victims. For Paris Hilton, Lindsay Lohan, and the other celebrities who were targeted, the burglaries were more than just a violation of their privacy. They were a reminder of the dangers of living in the public eye. The thefts left them feeling vulnerable and exposed, a stark contrast to the glamorous image they projected to the world. But the legacy of the bling ring extends far beyond the individuals involved. Their story has become a cultural phenomenon, immortalized in books, documentaries, and films. It has sparked conversations about celebrity culture, materialism, and the dangers of living in a world where image is everything. The bling ring's crimes were a product of their time, a reflection of a society that glorifies fame and wealth above all else. In the years since their downfall, the members of the bling ring have tried to move on with their lives. They have faced their mistakes, sought redemption, and worked to rebuild what they had lost. But their story serves as a reminder that the pursuit of fame and fortune often comes at a steep price. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession, the allure of celebrity, and the importance of staying true to oneself. As we reflect on the bling ring story, it's important to remember that fame and wealth are not the keys to happiness. True success comes from within, from the relationships we build, the values we uphold, and the lives we lead. The bling ring's journey is a reminder that the things we chase, whether it's fame, money, or material possessions, aren't often fleeting. What truly matters is the legacy we leave behind and the impact we have on the world around us. The story of the bling ring is one that will continue to captivate and intrigue for years to come. It's a tale of ambition, obsession, and the relentless pursuit of fame, but it's also a story of redemption, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit. The members of the Bling Ring made terrible mistakes, but they also found the strength to rebuild their lives and move forward. As we close this chapter, let's remember the lessons their story teaches us. Fame and fortune may be alluring, but they are not worth sacrificing our integrity, our relationships, or our freedom. True success comes from within, from the choices we make and the lives we lead. The Bling Ring story is a cautionary tale, but it's also a reminder that no matter how far we fall, it's never too late to turn our lives around. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the rise and fall of the Bling Ring. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating tales. And if you're interested in exploring another fascinating story, check out our video on insert related topic here. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and remember, true success is about more than just fame and fortune. See you tomorrow. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you wish you'd never left the warmth of your home. Steve tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he pulled into the driveway of his suburban Oklahoma City home. His wife, Helen, sitting quietly beside him. They had just returned from a rare night out, a movie followed by a quiet dinner at their favorite Italian restaurant. It was their day off, a chance to unwind from the stress of Steve's demanding job as the vice president of a local bank. Helen had been quiet for most of the ride home, lost in thought, but Steve didn't mind. He was just glad to have spent the evening with her, away from the pressures of work. As they entered the garage, Steve pressed the button to close the door behind them, the mechanical worry filling the silence. But before the door could fully close, another car sped in behind them, its headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. Steve froze, his heart pounding as two men stepped out of the car. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by hats and scarves. One of them approached Steve's window, tapping on the glass with the barrel of a gun. "Mr. Steve," the man said, his voice calm but firm, "we're from the federal police. We need you to come with us. This is a matter of your safety and your life." Helen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but Steve remained silent, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't right. Federal officers wouldn't approach him like this in the middle of the night in his own garage. But before he could react, the man opened the car door and pulled Steve out, shoving him against the wall. Helen screamed, but the other man was already at her side, his gun trained on her. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the first man said, his voice low and menacing. Steve's mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Were these men? What did they want from him? But why had they chosen him, of all people? As the men forced Steve and Helen into their house, Steve couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger, something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Little did he know, this night would unravel a story of crime, betrayal, and a criminal mastermind whose brilliance was matched only by his ruthlessness. This was the night that would change everything. The man who had orchestrated this nightmare was Terry Connor. It's a name that would soon become synonymous with fear and infamy. Terry's journey into the world of crime had begun decades earlier. In a small California town where he had grown up as the quiet, skinny kid who always seemed to be the target of bullies. Born in 1944 to a modest family, Terry had always felt out of place, as if he didn't belong in the world around him. He was intelligent, far more so than his peers. But his sharp mind was often overshadowed by his social awkwardness and the mild mental disorder that made it difficult for him to connect with others. Terry's parents did their best to provide for him, but they were struggling to make ends meet, and their attention was often divided between work and their other children. As a result, Terry spent much of his childhood alone, lost in his own thoughts and dreams. It was during these solitary moments that he began to develop a fascination with puzzles and problem solving. He would spend hours analyzing complex problems, breaking them down into smaller, more manageable parts until he found a solution. This skill would later become the foundation of his criminal career, but for now was just a way for Terry to escape the harsh realities of his life. As he grew older, Terry's intelligence and analytical mind began to manifest in more sinister ways. He started small, stealing from local businesses and experimenting with different methods of breaking and entering. At first, it was just a way to prove to himself that he could outsmart the system, but as his confidence grew, so did his ambitions. By the time he was in his early 20s, Terry had set his sights on a much bigger target: banks. His first major heist was a small bank in Arizona, a place he had chosen because of its minimal security and remote location. Terry spent weeks planning the operation, studying the bank's layout, the routines of its employees, and the weaknesses in its security systems. When the day finally came, Terry executed the plan flawlessly, slipping into the bank unnoticed and making off with a modest sum of money. It wasn't the life-changing amount, but, for Terry, was a victory of proof of concept that he could pull off something far more ambitious. The success of the heist fueled Terry's ambition, and he began to dream bigger, envisioning a life of wealth and power achieved through carefully planned heists. But his early successes also attracted the attention of law enforcement, and it wasn't long before Terry found himself behind bars. For most people, prison would have been the end of the road, but for Terry, it was just the beginning. Behind bars, he honed his skills, networked with other criminals, and laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history. It was during his time in prison that Terry met Joseph, a hardened criminal with a reputation for violence and fearlessness. Joseph, born in 1939 in Philadelphia, had a long history of highway robberies and scams. Like Terry, who relied on his intellect and planning, Joseph was the muscle, the enforcer, who could intimidate and overpower anyone who stood in his way. The two formed an unlikely partnership, with Terry as the mastermind and Joseph as the executor of their plans. Together, they began to recruit other criminals, assembling a gang that would help them carry out their heists. Terry's meticulous nature and Joseph's brute force made them a formidable team. They developed a system for their operations, which involved kidnapping bank managers and their families, forcing the managers to open the banks, and then making a swift escape. The gang operated with strict rules. No children were to be involved. In the kidnappings, no harm was to come to the hostages, and all members were to disguise themselves to avoid identification. After each heist, the gang would split up, making it difficult for law enforcement to track them. Terry also insisted that the stolen money be converted into diamonds, which were easier to hide and transport. This level of planning and discipline allowed them to carry out multiple heists without getting caught. But it also made them a prime target for law enforcement agencies determined to bring them to justice. The heist in Oklahoma City on December 28, 1982, was one of their most audacious plans. Steve, the bank's vice president, was the perfect target. He had no children, lived in a quiet neighborhood, and had access to the bank's security systems. Terry and his gang executed the plan flawlessly, holding Steve and Helen hostage overnight and forcing Steve to open the bank the next morning. The gang managed to steal $270,000 in just 30 minutes, leaving no trace of their identities. However, Steve's quick thinking allowed him to alert the police after the gang had left, leading to a massive manhunt. The police were baffled by the sophistication of the operation and realized they were dealing with a highly organized and experienced criminal group. As they dug deeper, they uncovered a pattern of similar heists across multiple states, all bearing the hallmarks of Terry and Joseph's methods. The detectives assigned to the case knew they were up against a formidable adversary, but they were determined to bring the gang to justice. The investigation led them to Terry's girlfriend in California, where they hoped to find clues about his whereabouts. However, Terry's meticulous planning and ability to stay one step ahead of the law made it difficult for the police to track him down. Terry and Joseph's partnership was the stuff of legends, a perfect blend of brains and brawn that made them nearly unstoppable. After their initial meeting in prison, the two quickly realized they complemented each other in ways that neither had experienced before. Terry, with his razor-sharp intellect and knack for meticulous planning, provided the blueprints for their operations. Joseph, on the other hand, brought the raw power and fearlessness needed to execute those plans without hesitation. Together, they began to build a criminal empire, recruiting a small but loyal group of accomplices who shared their vision of wealth and power. The gang's first major operation outside of prison was a bank heist in a small town in Nevada. Terry had spent weeks studying the bank's security systems, identifying weaknesses, and mapping out escape routes. Joseph, meanwhile, handled the recruitment of the team, selecting individuals who were skilled, reliable, and, most importantly, willing to follow orders without question. The heist itself was a masterpiece of precision and timing. Terry and his team entered the bank just as it opened, disguised as maintenance workers. They quickly overpowered the security guards and took the bank manager hostage, forcing him to open the vault. Within minutes, they had emptied the vault of its contents, stuffing the money into duffel bags and making their escape through a back alley. The entire operation took less than 15 minutes, and by the time the police arrived, the gang was long gone. The success of the heist solidified Terry and Joseph's reputation as the most dangerous criminals in the country. And it wasn't long before they began to attract the attention of law enforcement agencies at the highest levels. But Terry and Joseph weren't content to rest on their laurels. They knew that the key to staying ahead of the law was to constantly evolve and adapt their methods. After each heist, Terry would analyze what had worked and what hadn't, making adjustments to their plans to ensure they stayed one step ahead of the authorities. Joseph, meanwhile, focused on expanding their network of contacts, forging alliances with other criminal organizations and securing safe houses where the gang could lay low between jobs. One of the most significant changes Terry made to their operations was the introduction of psychological tactics. He realized that fear was a powerful tool, one that could be used to control not only their victims, but also the police. In one particularly daring heist, Terry and Joseph kidnapped the family of a bank manager and held them hostage overnight, threatening to harm them if the manager didn't cooperate. The next morning, the manager opened the bank for them, and the gang made off with over $500,000 in cash and valuables. The psychological impact of the heist was profound, not only on the victims, but also on the law enforcement officers tasked with bringing the gang to justice. The police were baffled by the gang's ability to strike with such precision and disappear without a trace, leaving behind only fear and confusion in their wake. As the gang's reputation grew, so did their ambitions. Terry began to dream of pulling off the ultimate heist, one that would cement their place in criminal history. He spent months planning the operation, studying the security systems of some of the most heavily guarded banks in the country. Eventually, he settled on a target, the First National Bank of Oklahoma City, one of the largest and most secure banks in the region. The bank's vault was rumored to contain millions of dollars in cash, gold, and other valuables, making it the perfect target for Terry's grand plan. But pulling off the heist would require more than just careful planning and brute force. It would require a level of coordination and discipline that few criminal organizations could achieve. Terry knew that the key to success lay in the gang's ability to work together as a single, cohesive unit, each member playing their part to perfection. To that end, he implemented a strict set of rules for the gang to follow. No one was to act independently or deviate from the plan in any way. Every detail, from the timing of the heist to the escape route, was carefully calculated and rehearsed. Terry also insisted that the gang avoid unnecessary violence, believing that it would only draw more attention from the police. Instead, he relied on intimidation and psychological manipulation to control their victims, a tactic that had proven highly effective in their previous heists. The night before the heist, Terry gathered the gang for a final briefing. They met in a secluded safe house on the outskirts of Oklahoma City, far from prying eyes. Terry laid out the plan in meticulous detail, going over every step of the operation and answering any questions the gang members had. Joseph, meanwhile, inspected the weapons and equipment they would be using, ensuring that everything was in perfect working order. As the meeting drew to a close, Terry looked around the room at the faces of his team. These were men and women who had put their trust in him, who had followed him into some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. He knew that the success of the heist depended on their ability to work together, to trust each other implicitly. "Remember," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this isn't just about the money. This is about proving that we're the best, that no one can stop us. If we stick to the plan and stay focused, we'll walk away with more than just a payday. We'll walk away with our freedom." The gang nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. They knew the risks, but they also knew the rewards, okay? And they were ready to do whatever it took to succeed. The next morning, the gang put their plan into action. Terry and Joseph led the team into the bank, disguised as federal agents. They moved with precision and confidence, their years of experience evident in every step they took. The bank's security guards were caught off guard, their training no match for the gang's ruthless efficiency. Within minutes, the gang had taken control of the bank, herding the employees and customers into a corner and securing the area. Terry approached the bank manager, a middle-aged man named Steve, and demanded that he open the vault. Steve hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. But Terry's cold, calculating gaze left no room for doubt. "Open the vault," Terry repeated, his voice low and menacing. "Or we'll start shooting." Steve nodded, his hands trembling as he entered the code into the vault's security system. The heavy door swung open, revealing stacks of cash, gold bars, and other valuables. Terry's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he motioned for the gang to start loading the money into their duffel bags. The heist was going exactly as planned, but as the gang worked, Terry couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had spent months planning every detail of the operation, but there was always the possibility of something going wrong. He glanced around the room, his eyes scanning for any signs of trouble. That's when he noticed it, a small, blinking, red light on the ceiling. It was a security camera, one that he had missed during his initial reconnaissance of the bank. Terry's heart skipped a beat as he realized the implications. The camera was still active. It meant that the police could be watching them, right? Now, tracking their every move. He quickly motioned for Joseph to join him, pointing out the camera. Joseph's face darkened as he understood the situation. "We need to move," he said, his voice tense. "Now." Terry nodded, his mind racing as he tried to figure out their next move. They had planned for every contingency, but this was something they hadn't anticipated. The gang finished loading the money into the duffel bags and made their way to the exit, their movements quick and deliberate. But as they stepped outside, they were met with a wall of police cars, their lights flashing and sirens blaring. The gang had walked right into a trap. The sight of the police cars surrounding the bank sent a wave of panic through the gang. Terry's mind raced as he tried to process what had gone wrong. He had planned every detail of the heist with meticulous precision. Somehow, the police had been one step ahead. The blinking red light on the security camera flashed in his mind, a glaring oversight that now threatened to undo everything they had worked for. Joseph, standing beside him, clenched his fists, his eyes darting around as he assessed the situation. The gang members behind them froze, their faces pale with fear. Terry knew they had only seconds to make a decision. "Back inside," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The gang obeyed without hesitation, retreating into the bank and slamming the door shut behind him. Terry's mind was a whirlwind of calculations as he tried to figure out their next move. The police had them surrounded, but they still had hostages: Steve, the bank manager, and a handful of employees and customers. If they played their cards right, they might still be able to negotiate their way out of this. Okay? But Terry also knew that time was not on their side. The longer they stayed inside the bank, the more likely it was that the police would storm the building. Okay? They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. Inside the bank, the atmosphere was tense. The hostages huddled together in a corner, their faces filled with fear. Terry approached Steve, his gun trained on the trembling man. "You," he said, his voice cold and steady, "are going to help us get out of here. If you do exactly as I say, no one gets hurt. But if you try anything stupid..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Steve nodded, his hands shaking as he raised them in surrender. Terry turned to Joseph and the rest of the gang, his mind racing as he formulated a plan. "We're going out the back," he said. "There's a service entrance that leads to an alley. If we move fast, we can make it to the cars before the police realize what's happening." Joseph nodded, his expression grim but determined. The gang members exchanged nervous glances, but said nothing. They trusted Terry, and they knew that their only chance of survival was to follow his lead. Terry handed Steve a phone and instructed him to call the police. "Tell them we're coming out," he said, "and tell them that if they try to stop us, we'll start shooting the hostages." Steve hesitated, his hands trembling as he dialed the number. Terry watched him closely, his finger resting on the trigger of his gun. He knew that one wrong move could mean the end for all of them. Outside, the police were preparing for a standoff. The bank was surrounded, with officers positioned at every exit. The SWAT team was on standby, ready to storm the building if necessary. The police chief, a grizzled veteran named Detective Harris, stood at the front of the barricade, his eyes fixed on the bank's doors. He had been tracking Terry and Joseph for months, and he wasn't about to let them slip through his fingers. Now, when the call came in from Steve, Harris listened carefully, his jaw tightening as he heard the demands. "We're coming out," Steve said, his voice shaking. "If you try to stop us, they'll start shooting the hostages." Harris clenched his fists, his mind racing as he tried to figure out the best course of action. He knew that Terry and Joseph were dangerous, but he also knew that he couldn't risk the lives of the hostages. After a moment of tense silence, Harris made his decision. "Let them go," he said to his team. "Follow them. We'll get them when they least expect it." The officers nodded, their faces set with determination. They had been chasing Terry and Joseph for too long to let them escape now. Inside the bank, Terry and his gang were preparing to make their move. They had gathered the hostages together and were using them as human shields as they made their way to the service entrance. Terry led the way, his gun trained on Steve as they moved through the bank's corridors. Joseph brought up the rear, his eyes scanning for any signs of trouble. The gang members followed closely behind, their duffel bags filled with cash and valuables slung over their shoulders. As they reached the service entrance, Terry paused, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that the next few minutes would determine whether they lived or died. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped outside, his gun pressed against Steve's back. The alley was empty, but Terry knew that the police were watching. He motioned for the gang to follow, their movements quick and deliberate. They made their way to the cars parked at the end of the alley, their eyes darting around for any signs of the police. Terry's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts as he tried to anticipate the police's next move. He knew that they wouldn't let them go without a fight, but he also knew that they had the upper hand for now. As the gang piled into the cars, Terry kept his gun trained on Steve. "You're coming with us," he said, his voice cold and steady. "The police tried to follow us. You're the first one to go." Steve nodded, his face pale with fear. Terry shoved him into the back seat of one of the cars and climbed in after him, his eyes scanning the alley for any signs of movement. Joseph took the wheel, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he started the engine. The other gang members followed in a second car, their faces set with determination. As they pulled out of the alley, Terry kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, watching for any signs of the police. He knew that they were being followed, but he also knew that they had a head start. If they could just make it to the highway, they might be able to lose the police in the traffic. But Terry also knew that the police wouldn't give up that easily. They had been chasing him and Joseph for too long to let them escape now. The car sped through the streets of Oklahoma City, their tires screeching as they rounded corners and weaved through traffic. Terry's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts as he tried to anticipate the police's next move. He knew that they would be setting up roadblocks and checkpoints, trying to cut off their escape routes. But Terry also knew the city like the back of his hand, and he had planned for this. He directed Joseph to take a series of back roads and side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the police were likely to be waiting. The gang members in the second car followed closely behind, their eyes darting around for any signs of trouble. As they approached the highway, Terry felt a surge of hope. If they could just make it onto the open road, they might be able to lose the police for good. But as they merged onto the highway, Terry's heart sank. Up ahead, he could see a line of police cars blocking the road, their lights flashing and sirens blaring. The police had set up a roadblock. There was no way around it. Terry's mind raced as he tried to figure out their next move. They couldn't stop. If they did, they would be caught for sure. But they also couldn't risk a high-speed chase with the police. He glanced at Joseph, who was gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. "We're going through," Terry said, his voice calm but firm. "Hold on." Joseph nodded, his jaw clenched as he pressed down on the accelerator. The car surged forward, its engine roaring as it sped toward the roadblock. The police officers scattered as the car barreled through the barricade, the sound of shattering glass and screeching metal filling the air. Terry's heart pounded in his chest as they raced down the highway, the police cars close behind. He knew that they were running out of time, but he also knew that they couldn't give up now. They had come too far to let the police catch them. As they sped down the highway, Terry's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew that they needed to find a place to lay low, somewhere the police wouldn't think to look. He directed Joseph to take the next exit, leading them onto a series of back roads that wound through the countryside. Gang members in the second car followed closely behind, their faces set with determination. As they drove, Terry kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, watching for any signs of the police. He knew that they were still out there, still chasing them, but he also knew that they had a chance if they could just stay one step ahead. The cars sped through the night, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they made their way to a remote safe house that Terry had prepared for just such an occasion. It was a risky move, but Terry knew that it was their only chance. As they pulled up to the safe house, Terry felt a surge of relief. They had made it for now. He also knew that the police wouldn't give up that easily. The chase was far from over. The safe house was an old, abandoned farmhouse tucked away in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods and miles of empty fields. Terry had chosen it for its isolation, knowing that it would be the last place the police would think to look. As the cars pulled up to the house, Terry felt a mix of relief and tension. They had made it this far, but the night was far from over. The gang members piled out of the cars, their faces pale and drawn from the adrenaline of the chase. Terry quickly ushered them inside, his eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. He knew that the police would be searching for them, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down now. Inside, the house was sparse and dusty, with only a few pieces of furniture and some basic supplies. Terry had stocked it with enough food and water to last them a few days, but it was far from comfortable. Still, it was better than being caught by the police. As the gang settled in, Terry took charge, his mind already working on their next move. He knew that they couldn't stay here for long. The police would eventually track them down, but they needed time to regroup and come up with a plan. He assigned Joseph to keep watch outside, while the rest of the gang members took turns resting and keeping an eye on the hostages. Steve, the bank manager, was still with them, his face pale and his hands trembling as he sat in a corner of the room. Terry approached him, his gun still in hand. "You're going to help us get out of this," he said, his voice cold and steady. "If you cooperate, you might just live to see another day." Steve nodded, his eyes wide with fear. He knew that he was in a dangerous situation, but he also knew that he had no choice but to do as he was told. Terry turned his attention to the rest of the gang, his mind racing as he tried to figure out their next move. They had the money from the heist, but it was useless if they couldn't get away with it. He knew that the police would be watching all the usual escape routes, so they needed to come up with something unexpected. After a few moments of tense silence, Terry finally spoke. "We're going to split up," he said. "It's the only way to throw them off our trail. Joseph and I will take one car, and the rest of you will take the other. We'll meet up at the rendezvous point in 3 days. If anyone gets caught, they're on their own." The gang members nodded, their faces set with determination. They knew the risks, but they also knew that they had no other choice. Terry handed out fake IDs and cash to each of them, along with instructions on how to get to the rendezvous point. He also gave them strict orders to avoid drawing attention. Themselves, no flashy spending, no unnecessary risks. They needed to stay under the radar if they were going to make it out of this alive. As the gang prepared to leave, Terry pulled Joseph aside. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent. Joseph nodded, his expression grim. The two men stepped outside, where they could speak without being overheard. "This isn't over," Terry said, his eyes scanning the darkness. "The police aren't going to stop until they catch us. Need to be ready for anything." Joseph nodded, his jaw clenched. "It's a plan?" he asked. Terry took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a solution. "We need to disappear," he said, finally, completely. "No more heists, no more risks. We take the money we have and we go underground. We change our names, our appearances, everything. We start over." Joseph frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. "And what about the others?" he asked. Terry shook his head. "They're on their own," he said. "We can't afford to take any chances. If they get caught, they'll lead the police right to us." Joseph nodded, his expression grim but determined. He knew that Terry was right. They couldn't afford to take any more risks. It was time to cut their losses and disappear. As the gang prepared to leave, Terry felt a pang of guilt. He had led these people into this life, and now he was leaving them to fend for themselves. But he also knew that he had no other choice. The stakes were too high, and he couldn't afford to let sentimentality cloud his judgment. He gave the gang members one last look before turning away, his mind already focused on the next step. Joseph followed him to the car, his expression unreadable. The two men climbed in, and Terry started the engine, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As they drove away from the safe house, Terry couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. The road behind them was empty. The only sound, the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. The next few days were a blur of tension and paranoia. Terry and Joseph drove through the night, avoiding main roads and sticking to back roads and side streets. They stopped only to refuel and grab quick meals, always keeping an eye out for any signs of the police. Terry's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts as he tried to anticipate the police's next move. He knew that they would be searching for them, and he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. As they approached the rendezvous point, Terry felt a surge of relief. They had made it thus far, but he also knew that the hardest part was still ahead. The rendezvous point was an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a small town. Terry had chosen it for its isolation and its proximity to the Canadian border. If they could just make it across the border, they would be home free. As they pulled up to the warehouse, Terry's heart sank. The place was deserted, with no sign of the other gang members. He knew that they had either been caught or had decided to go their own way. Either way, it was a setback, but Terry wasn't about to let it stop him. He and Joseph quickly unloaded the money from the car and carried it inside, their movements quick and deliberate. The warehouse was dark and musty, with only a few beams of light filtering through the cracks in the walls. Terry set to work, his mind racing as he tried to figure out their next move. They needed to get across the border, but they couldn't risk using their usual methods. The police would be watching all the usual crossing points, so they needed to come up with something unexpected. After a few moments of tense silence, Terry finally spoke. "We're going to go by boat," he said. "It's a small fishing village about 50 miles from here. We can hire a boat and cross the border that way. It's risky, but it's our best shot." Joseph nodded, his expression grim but determined. He knew that they had no other choice. The two men quickly packed up the money and loaded it back into the car, their movements quick and efficient. As they drove to the fishing village, Terry's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew that this was their last chance, and he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The stakes were too high, and the consequences of failure were too dire. When they finally arrived at the fishing village, Terry felt a surge of hope. The place was small and quiet, with only a few boats bobbing in. The harbor. He and Joseph quickly found a fisherman who was willing to take them across the border for the right price. The man was old and grizzled, with a face weathered by years of hard work. He didn't ask any questions, and Terry didn't offer any explanations. They loaded the money onto the boat and set off into the night. The sound of the waves lapping against the hull, the only noise in the darkness. As they crossed the border, Terry felt a surge of relief. They had made it, They were free. But as they stepped onto Canadian soil, Terry couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. The police would be looking for them, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down. They needed to disappear completely, to start over in a new life where no one would know their names or their past. It was a daunting task, but Terry knew that they had no other choice. They had come too far to turn back now. As they walked away from the boat, Terry felt a mix of emotions, relief, fear, and a strange sense of determination. They had escaped the police, but they were still far from safe. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Terry knew that they had what it took to survive. They were survivors, and they would do whatever it took to stay one step ahead of the law. The first few weeks in Canada were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Terry and Joseph kept a low profile, avoiding crowded places and sticking to small, remote towns where they were less likely to be recognized. They used the fake IDs Terry had prepared, posing as brothers who had moved north for work. The money from the heist was carefully hidden, divided into small amounts and stashed in various locations to avoid drawing attention. Terry knew that they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. One wrong move, and their new lives would come crashing down. They rented a small, run-down cabin in the woods, far from prying eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them safe for the time being. Terry spent his days planning their next move, while Joseph handled the practicalities of their new life, buying groceries, maintaining the cabin, and keeping an eye out for any signs of trouble. The two men rarely spoke, their relationship strained by the weight of their situation, but they both knew that they needed each other if they were going to survive. As the weeks turned into months, Terry began to relax slightly. The police hadn't caught up to them, and it seemed like they might actually be able to start over. But Terry's mind was never at ease. He knew that the past had a way of catching up to you, no matter how far you ran. He spent hours each day scanning the news for any mention of their heist or the manhunt that had followed. So far, there had been nothing, but Terry knew that didn't mean they were in the clear. He also knew that they couldn't stay in the cabin forever. They needed to find a way to blend in, to become part of the community without drawing attention to themselves. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant vigilance and careful planning. One day, while Joseph was out running errands, Terry decided to take a risk. He drove to the nearest town, a small, sleepy place with a single main street and a handful of shops. He needed to get a feel for the area, to see if it was a place where they could settle down without raising suspicions. As he walked down the street, Terry kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the locals. He stopped at a diner, ordering a cup of coffee and sitting in a corner booth where he could observe the room without being noticed. The place was quiet, with only a few customers scattered around the room. Terry listened to their conversations, picking up bits and pieces of local gossip. It seemed like a friendly, close-knit community, but Terry knew that could work both for and against them. On one hand, it would be easier to blend in if they became part of the community. On the other hand, strangers were always noticed in small towns, and Terry couldn't afford to draw any attention to himself as he sipped his coffee. Terry's mind wandered back to the heist. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at how well they had pulled it off. It had been a masterpiece of planning and execution, and Terry knew that it would go down in criminal history as one of the most daring heists of all time. But he also knew that it had come at a cost. The gang members they had left behind were either in prison or on the run, and Terry couldn't shake the feeling that he had abandoned them. He tried to push the thought aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. They needed to find a way to start over, to build a new life where they could live in peace. But Terry knew that it wouldn't be easy. The past had a way of catching up to you, no matter how far you ran. When Joseph returned to the cabin that evening, Terry was waiting for him. He had spent the day thinking about their next move, and he knew that they needed to take action soon. "We can't stay here forever," Terry said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to find a way to blend in, to become part of the community. If we stay isolated like this, we're just going to draw attention to ourselves." Joseph nodded, his expression grim. He knew that Terry was right, but he also knew that it was a risky move. "What you suggest?" he asked. Terry took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. "We need to find jobs," he said, finally. "Something low-key that won't draw too much attention. We can say we're brothers who moved here for work. If we can establish ourselves as part of the community, we'll be less likely to be noticed." Joseph frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. "And what about the money?" he asked. Terry shook his head. "Okay, we can't touch it," he said. "Not yet. Need to live like we're broke, like we're just trying to make ends meet. If we start spending too much, people will notice." Joseph nodded, his expression grim but determined. He knew that Terry was right. They couldn't afford to take any risks. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Terry and Joseph found jobs at a local lumberyard, doing manual labor that paid just enough to cover their expenses. They kept to themselves, avoiding unnecessary conversations and sticking to their story about being brothers who had moved north for work. The locals were friendly but reserved, and Terry and Joseph did their best to blend in without drawing attention to themselves. It wasn't easy, but they managed to establish themselves as part of the community, albeit on the fringes. Terry knew that they couldn't afford to get too comfortable, but he also knew that they needed to build a life if they were going to survive. As the months passed, Terry began to relax slightly. The police hadn't caught up to them, and it seemed like they might actually be able to start over. But Terry's mind was never at ease. He knew that the past had a way of catching up to you, no matter how far you ran. He spent hours each day scanning the news for any mention of their heists or the manhunt that had followed. So far, there had been nothing, but Terry knew that didn't mean they were in the clear. He also knew that they couldn't stay in the cabin forever. They needed to find a way to blend in, to become part of the community without drawing attention to themselves. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant vigilance and careful planning. One day, while Joseph was out running errands, Terry decided to take a risk. He drove to the nearest town, a small, sleepy place with a single main street and a handful of shops. He needed to get a feel for the area, to see if it was a place where they could settle down without raising suspicions. As he walked down the street, Terry kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the locals. He stopped at a diner, ordering a cup of coffee and sitting in a corner booth where he could observe the room without being noticed. The place was quiet, with only a few customers scattered around the room. Terry listened to their conversations, picking up bits and pieces of local gossip. It seemed like a friendly, close-knit community, but Terry knew that could work both for and against them. On one hand, it would be easier to blend in if they became part of the community. On the other hand, strangers were always noticed in small towns, and Terry couldn't afford to draw any attention to himself. As he sipped his coffee, Terry's mind wandered back to the heist. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at how well they had pulled it off. It had been a masterpiece of planning and execution, and Terry knew that it would go down in criminal history as one of the most daring heists of all time. But he also knew that it had come at a cost. The gang members they had left behind were either in prison or on the run, and Terry couldn't shake the feeling that he had abandoned them. He tried to push the thought aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. They needed to find a way to start over, to build a new life where they could live in peace. But Terry knew that it wouldn't be easy. The past had a way of catching up to you, no matter how far you ran. When Joseph returned to the cabin that evening, Terry was waiting for him. He had spent the day thinking about their next move, and he knew that they needed to take action soon. "We can't stay here forever," Terry said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to find a way to blend in, to become part of the community. If we stay isolated like this, we're just going to draw attention to ourselves." Joseph nodded, his expression grim. He knew that Terry was right, but he also knew that it was a risky move. "What do you suggest?" he asked. Terry took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. "We need to find jobs," he said, finally, "something low-key that won't draw too much attention. We can say we're brothers who moved here for work. If we can establish ourselves as part of the community, we'll be less likely to be noticed." Joseph frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. "And what about the money?" he asked. Terry shook his head. "We can't touch it," he said. "Not yet. We need to live like we're broke, like we're just trying to make ends meet. If we start spending too much, people will notice." Joseph nodded, his expression grim but determined. He knew that Terry was right. They couldn't afford to take any risks. Life in the small Canadian town settled into a rhythm, though Terry's mind never fully relaxed. The days were filled with the monotony of manual labor at the lumberyard, while the nights were spent in the quiet solitude of their cabin. Terry and Joseph kept to themselves, avoiding unnecessary interactions with the locals. They became known as the quiet brothers who kept to themselves, a reputation that suited their need for anonymity. Terry's paranoia never fully subsided, though. He spent hours each night scanning the news, both local and international, for any mention of their heists or the manhunt that had followed. So far, there had been nothing, but Terry knew that didn't mean they were safe. The past had a way of catching up to you, no matter how far you ran. One evening, as Terry sat by the fireplace, his mind wandered back to the gang members they had left behind. He wondered what had happened to them, whether they had been caught, killed, or if they had managed to escape like he and Joseph had. He tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. They needed to stay focused, too, keep their heads down and avoid drawing attention to themselves. But the guilt gnawed at him, a constant reminder of the life they had left behind. Joseph, on the other hand, seemed to have adjusted more easily to their new life. He spent his days working at the lumberyard and his nights tinkering with an old truck they had bought to get around. He rarely spoke about the past, and Terry didn't press him. They both knew that dwelling on it wouldn't do them any good. As the months passed, Terry began to feel a sense of cautious optimism. The police hadn't caught up to them, and it seemed like they might actually be able to start over. They had managed to establish themselves as part of the community, albeit on the fringes, and the locals had mostly accepted them as the quiet brothers who kept to themselves. Terry even allowed himself to think about the future, about the possibility of building a new life where they could live in peace, but he knew that they couldn't afford to get too comfortable. The past was always lurking in the shadows, waiting to catch up to them. One day, while Terry was at the lumberyard, he overheard a conversation that sent a chill down his spine. Two of his co-workers were talking about a news report they had seen the night before. "Did you hear about those bank robbers?" one of them asked. "The ones who pulled off that big heist down in the States. They say they're still on the run." Terry's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his face neutral, pretending to focus on his work. The other co-worker nodded. "Yeah, I heard about that. They say the police are offering a huge reward for any information leading to their capture. Can you imagine? Those guys must be living like kings somewhere, laughing at the cops." Terry's hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew that they couldn't afford to draw any attention to themselves. Not now. He finished his shift and headed back to the cabin, his mind racing. When he got home, Terry immediately turned on the radio, scanning the stations for any news about the heist. He found a station that was reporting on the manhunt, and his heart sank as he listened. The police were still searching for them, and the reward for information leading to their capture had been increased. Terry knew that it was only a matter of time before someone put two and two together. He turned off the radio and sat down, his mind racing as he tried to figure out their next move. They couldn't stay here forever, but they also couldn't afford to run again. They needed to find a way to disappear completely, to start over, in a place where no one would know their names or their past. That night, Terry sat down with Joseph to discuss their options. "We can't stay here," Terry said, his voice low and urgent. "The police are still looking for us, and it's only a matter of time before someone figures out who we are. We need to find a way to disappear completely, to start over in a place where no one will know us." Joseph nodded, his expression grim. He knew that Terry was right, but he also knew that it wouldn't be easy. "What do you suggest?" he asked. Terry took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. "We need to change our identities," he said, finally. "New names, new appearances, everything. We need to become different people so that even if someone recognizes us, they won't be able to prove it." Joseph frowned, his brow furrowed. in thought. "And how do we do that?" he asked. Terry shook his head. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But we need to figure it out soon. We can't afford to wait." The next few days were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Terry spent hours researching how to create new identities, while Joseph handled the practicalities of their daily lives. They knew that they couldn't afford to make any mistakes, so they took their time, carefully planning every detail. Terry managed to get his hands on some fake documents, including new passports and driver's licenses. He also found a contact who could help them change their appearance's hair dye, contact lenses, even minor plastic surgery if necessary. It was a risky move, but Terry knew that they had no other choice. They needed to disappear completely to become different people if they were going to survive. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Terry felt a pang of regret. They had managed to build a life here, however fragile, and it was hard to let it go. But he also knew that they couldn't afford to stay. The past was catching up to them, and they needed to stay one step ahead if they were going to survive. They packed up their belongings and loaded them into the truck, their movements quick and efficient. Terry took one last look around the cabin, his mind filled with memories of the past few months. It had been a strange, quiet life, but it had been theirs. Now, they were leaving it all behind, stepping into the unknown once again. As they drove away from the cabin, Terry's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that they had what it took to survive. They were survivors, and they would do whatever it took to stay one step ahead of the law. The truck rumbled down the dirt road, the sound of the engine filling the silence. Terry glanced at Joseph, who was gripping the steering wheel tightly, his expression unreadable. Body didn't speak, but they didn't need to. They both knew what was at stake, and they were ready to do whatever it took to stay free. The road stretched out ahead of them, long and uncertain. Terry knew that they were heading into the unknown, but he also knew that they had no other choice. The past was catching up to them, and they needed to stay one step ahead if they were going to survive. As they drove, Terry's mind wandered back to the heist, to the life they had left behind. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at how far they had come, but he also knew that the hardest part was still ahead. They needed to disappear completely to become different people if they were going to survive. It was a daunting task, but Terry knew that they had no other choice. They had come too far to turn back now. Despite their best efforts, Terry and Joseph managed to evade capture for years, continuing their spree of bank robberies and kidnappings. Their methods evolved, becoming more violent and daring with each heist. In one instance, Joseph tied a bank manager to a fake explosive belt, using psychological tactics to intimidate both the victim and the police. The gang's notoriety grew, and they became the most wanted criminals in the country. The police, however, were not giving up. They began to piece together information from informants and witnesses, slowly closing in on the gang. One of the key breakthroughs came when they arrested Kraft, a close associate of Terry and Joseph. After days of interrogation, Kraft revealed crucial details about the gang's operations, including the identity of John, their right-hand man. The police tracked John to a phone booth in San Francisco, where he was waiting for a call from Terry and Joseph. By tapping the call, they learned that the gang was planning another heist in Chicago. The police mobilized quickly, distributing photos of Terry and Joseph to all departments and setting up surveillance in the area. Their efforts paid off when they received a tip about a man matching Joseph's description, renting a room under a fake name. However, when they moved in to arrest him, they found Terry instead. Joseph had once again managed to escape, but the police were getting closer. The arrest of Terry was a significant victory for law enforcement, but Joseph remained at large. The police continued their search, using every resource at their disposal to track him down. They discovered that Joseph had been living under various aliases, buying and selling cars to fund his operations. He had also started a family with a wife and child, which added a new layer of complexity to the manhunt. The police eventually located Joseph's hideout, a remote house on an island in the middle of a forest. They surrounded the property and waited for the right moment to strike. When Joseph finally emerged, he surrendered without a fight, bringing an end to his years on the run. The police found a stash of weapons, stolen money, and diamonds in the house, along with evidence of his involvement in numerous heists. Joseph's capture marked the end of an era for the gang, but the story was far from over. Terry, who had been in custody since his arrest, was brought in to testify against Joseph. The two were transported together for their trial, but Terry had one last trick up his sleeve. Using a hidden nail, he picked the lock on his handcuffs and freed himself and Joseph. They overpowered the officers, tied them up, and stole the police car, making a daring escape. The escape reignited the manhunt, and Terry and Joseph resumed their criminal activities with renewed vigor. They carried out several more heists, stealing millions of dollars and leaving law enforcement scrambling to keep up. Their methods became even more brazen, with the duo abandoning disguises and relying solely on their reputation to intimidate their victims. However, the pressure from law enforcement and the increasing number of informants began to take its toll. One by one, members of their gang turned themselves in, providing the police with valuable information about their operations. A final blow came when the police arrested John, the gang's right-hand man, and used him to track down Terry and Joseph. The two were eventually captured and sentenced to life in prison, bringing an end to their reign of terror. Their story, however, remains one of the most fascinating and complex tales of crime and punishment in American history. It is a testament to the lengths to which individuals will go in pursuit of wealth and power, and the relentless determination of law enforcement to bring them to justice. The legacy of Terry and Joseph serves as a reminder of the thin line between brilliance and madness, and the consequences of crossing it. See you tomorrow.